He only meant to water his horse. Morning hadn't yet stretched full across the sky. Pale gray lingered over the valley, the kind of half-light where even a tree stump might look like something crouched and waiting. His boots pressed down into dry grass still heavy with dew. In the distance, birds woke up slow. No hurry. No threat. Just the hush of a world between night and what comes after. He led the roan gelding by the reins. The animal's sides were speckled with dust, as if it, too, had given up on shaking the trail from its coat. They came to the trough near the edge of the river bend, fed by runoff, shaded by cottonwoods. There was always water here, cool and clean. But the horse didn't drink. It lifted its head, ears twitching. The rancher followed its gaze. Movement. 20 paces off. A man crouched low, hands frantic in the earth. He wasn't digging like a farmer, he was digging like someone being chased by time. Sweat soaked his back. His clothes were ragged, too clean in some places, too stained in others. And near him, 2 bundles wrapped in what looked like quilted rags, still as river stones. The rancher didn't speak. Just watched. The man didn't notice him at first, kept on with the dirt, the panic, the panting. Then a cry cracked the silence. Soft. What? Barely formed. 1 bundle shifted. The man froze. The rancher stepped forward. They saw each other. The digging man muttered something, words chewed through by fear. She made me, don't you look at me like that, I didn't know what else. He looked at the bundle that had moved, then at the still one. Then he ran. No coat. No boots. Just ran. The roan let out a low snort. The rancher knelt. The first bundle was a baby girl. Her skin was ash blue and slick with cold. Her eyes fluttered under bruised lids. The second, another girl, was so still he thought she might have already passed. But then her fingers twitched. Both were swaddled in what used to be a patchwork shawl, one piece torn and retied like someone had done it in the dark. The man exhaled once through his nose. He looked around. No footprints but his and the one who fled. No house nearby. No horse prints. No hint of shelter. Only then did he see her. Just beyond the tree line, half hidden in tall grass and dying goldenrod. A woman, barefoot. Yellow dress torn at the hem. Hair tangled like wind-blown hay. She sat against a stump, head down, as if her neck couldn't hold the weight anymore. Her legs were drawn up, knees to chest, arms limp beside her. For a second he thought she might be dead. But her chest rose, slow, ragged, the breath of someone who hadn't quite chosen to live, but hadn't stopped either. He didn't call out. Just watched her, same as he had the horse, the man, the morning. The babies made tiny noises. One coughed, then cried again, a wet, hungry wail that barely carried past the roots. He stood, gently gathered the girls in the folds of his coat, tucking them tight into the crook of his arms. Then he walked toward her. She didn't move as he approached. Didn't look up. He knelt beside her. For a long minute he said nothing. Let the wind move around them like it could carry the silence on its back. Finally he whispered, "They yours?" Her lips parted, cracked. A trickle of blood traced her chin where it had dried into the hollow of her throat. She didn't answer. Just blinked once slow. Then again. He tried again. "You hurt." Still nothing. So he did the only thing he knew to do. He reached down, one arm under her knees, the other across her back, and lifted. She was lighter than she should have been. She let out a breath, not a protest, more like a sigh that had been waiting all night to leave. The rancher turned, baby still tucked against his chest, woman folded in his arms like a question he didn't know how to answer. He walked back toward the wagon. Dust kicked up behind him, lazy and slow. They reached the cart. He placed the babies down first into the grain sacks piled in the corner. They shifted, whined, but didn't cry again. Then he settled the woman on a blanket beside them, tucking another over her shoulders. He took the reins in his hand and turned the horse toward home. The trail back was mostly uphill. It took hours. He said nothing the whole way. Once he looked back. Her eyes were open now, watching him. But still she said nothing. The cabin stood quiet at the ridge. One window shutter hung loose. Smoke from the chimney was long gone. Inside it smelled of pine ash and silence. He carried her in. laid her on the narrow bed against the far wall, pulled a worn wool quilt to her chin. She flinched when his fingers brushed hers. He stepped back, stood in the doorway for a long while. Then he returned to the wagon, lifted the babies out one by one, and brought them inside. There was no crib. So he opened the bottom drawer of a wooden dresser, patted it with an old flannel shirt, and laid the girls side by side. The one who had cried curled her fists under her chin. The other's mouth opened like she wanted to, but no sound came. He poured water into a tin bowl, lit a lamp, and wiped the sweat from his neck. The woman slept. The babies breathed. The rancher sat on the floor near the stove, one knee drawn up, arms crossed over it. His eyes didn't move. He didn't know their names. He didn't know hers. He didn't even know what they were running from. But they were in his house. And he didn't mind the sound. By dawn the next day she had sat up. Just barely. Just enough to reach for the water pail and drink with trembling hands. He was outside splitting wood. She watched him through the cracked door. His shirt was off, his shoulders marked with old sun scars. He moved slow, careful, the way men do when they've carried grief too long and don't want to drop anything else. One baby began to fuss. The woman pulled her into her arms, not expertly but with a mother's need. Her fingers trembled. The second girl stirred and she scooped her too, cradling both against her chest, eyes closed, rocking. The rancher stepped inside with an armful of wood. He paused. She didn't look at him. He placed the logs in the crate beside the stove, then handed her a cup. She hesitated. Took it. Warm broth, thin but steady. She drank. Only when it was empty did she whisper, "Why?" He didn't answer. She tried again. "You could have left us." He looked at the babies. Then at her. Didn't seem right. Silence. Again. She stared into the quilt, biting her lip. "You don't know what I've done," she said. He nodded once. "I don't. Ain't your burden." He looked back toward the door. "You were sitting by a grave." Her head lowered. "Didn't seem like you wanted to live," he added. "I didn't." He said nothing more. Just stepped out, boots quiet on the wood. She looked down at the babies. "I wasn't gonna bury them." "Not really," she whispered to the girls. I thought if I left them there, maybe someone better would come." The one with the bruised lips squirmed as if disagreeing. A long time passed before she whispered, "But I guess he did." That night, the wind knocked the shutter loose. The rancher rose and tied it shut with a strip of leather. Inside, the woman lay curled on the bed, the babies beside her in the drawer. He sat again by the stove. The coals were still glowing, soft red like an ember that didn't know it had survived. She looked over at him. The lines on his face weren't deep, but they were old in a way that had nothing to do with age. "Your wife?" she asked, gesturing to the dress still folded on the chair. He looked down. She passed. She nodded as if that explained everything. "She have kids?" He shook his head. The woman tucked the babies closer. "Then maybe these are yours now," she whispered. He didn't reply. But he didn't look away. She closed her eyes, breath shallow. The fire crackled. The drawer creaked softly as the babies shifted in their sleep. The rancher reached out and placed one hand gently on the back of the chair across from him, then pulled it slightly away from the table. A space made. Not claimed. Just offered. Morning crawled in with the hush of old regret, brushing golden light through warped wood slats above the bed. It spilled slowly across the floor, touched the dust where it danced in air no one had stirred yet, and finally reached the drawer. The drawer where the babies slept. The rancher was already outside. He'd been up before the sun, same as always. Chopping wood in measured strokes. Feeding the roan. Boiling water that he'd leave warm on the stove, because that's what you do when you're not sure someone will ask, but they might need it anyway. Inside, the woman lay curled, her back to the world, her breath caught between rest and remembering. She hadn't moved much in the night, not even when one of the babies whimpered in her sleep. But now she stirred, slowly, fingers clutching at the worn quilt like she wasn't sure if it was real. Or hers. She sat up like someone being pulled from underwater. Her hair clung to her cheek, damp from sweat or dreams. She pushed it back, blinked against the morning and looked toward the drawer. Two babies. Sleeping side by side. One had kicked her leg free, and the tiny foot rested against the rim of the wood like she was already trying to stretch past the place she'd been given. The other girl's hand gripped the edge of the quilt shirt she'd been wrapped in, holding it like a memory. The woman reached for them. Her arms trembled, not just from weakness but from the ache that comes when you're not sure you're allowed to touch what you brought into the world. She lifted one first, then the other, held them both against her chest like she had something to prove to herself. "Still here," she whispered. "Still here, still here." The door creaked and she flinched. But it was only him, the rancher. A plate in one hand, a cup of water in the other. He said nothing, just nodded once and placed the things on the small table. She watched him with the same wariness people give fire, grateful for the heat but always aware it can burn. "Thank you," she said, voice small. He nodded again. Didn't stay. But before he turned, she blurted, "You sleep?" He looked at her, the lines around his mouth drawing tight. Enough. She wanted to say more. Ask more. But the baby shifted and the moment folded in on itself. She fed them what little she could from the jar of goat's milk he'd left nearby, mixing it with warm water as she'd seen a midwife do once. They took it greedily like they already knew hunger too well. After, she placed them back in the drawer gently, tucking the blanket around them with slow, careful fingers. Then she stood. Her knees wobbled. Her hip burned. But she stayed standing. There were clothes folded neatly on a stool, rough cotton, a bit big but clean. She changed behind the door, wincing as the dress slid off her skin. Bruises painted her ribs like spilled ink. Her shoulder had bite marks. Her thighs, a scab she didn't want to think about. She stared at the girl in the mirror. Sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, hair matted and darker with grease. She didn't recognize that girl. But she pulled the cotton shirt over herself anyway. She braided her hair in silence. Then she opened the door. He was sitting on the porch, sharpening a knife. Not fast, not with urgency. Just rhythm. Like a man who had nothing left to say to time but still wanted to be heard. She stepped out, barefoot, and stood in the sun. It didn't hurt like she thought it would. "I can work," she said quietly. He looked up. "I ain't trying to be a burden." He didn't argue. Just pointed toward the chicken coop. "Some hens gone broody," he said. "Could use sortin'." She nodded. She gathered eggs with shaking hands, dropping one. It cracked in the grass. She winced, but when she looked back, he hadn't moved. Just kept carving, a handle this time, not a blade. At midday, he brought out 2 tin plates with bread and root stew. She tried not to eat too fast. He didn't speak, but he didn't look away either. After, he handed her a wrapped cloth. Inside was a small carving knife, handle smooth and worn. She stared. "For what?" He motioned to the porch rail. "If your hands still want something to hold." She didn't say thank you, not out loud. But she carved that night, soft strokes into pine bark while the babies slept in their drawer and the wind sang against the shutters. She carved a flower. Then a girl. Then a spoon. She set it beside the drawer. When he saw it the next morning, he didn't speak. Just brushed his fingers along the edge and nodded once. Days passed that way. Quiet. Chores. Feeding. Whittling. Shared glances. One morning she asked his name. He looked surprised, like he'd forgotten he had one worth saying. "Colt," he said. She nodded. "Lena." He repeated it once, soft. That night she cried while holding one baby close. She didn't make a sound, but her shoulders shook. He saw from the doorway. Said nothing. Just placed another quilt at the edge of her bed and walked away. By the end of the week, the baby started making noises, coos, burbles, that strange half-laugh newborns make when they're dreaming something safe. Colt built a cradle out of scrap wood. He never said it was for them. But it sat near the stove now, beside the drawer, lined with wool and smelling faintly of cedar. Lena moved them into it without asking. One of the girls gripped her finger tight as if trying to keep her tethered to earth. Colt saw it, smiled a little. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled back. Not a wide thing, but real. A flicker of something lost and maybe not entirely gone. She swept the floor later that day. Washed the cups. Even sang softly when she thought no one could hear. But he did. And his hands stilled for just a second. That night she sat on the porch beside him. He handed her a half-finished carving, a spoon. "Thought maybe you'd finish it," he said. She took it, tracing the grooves. "Why a spoon?" He looked out at the stars. "Used to be my wife would say love ain't loud. It's in the stirrin'. In the way you pass bread without a skin. How you wait for the other to eat first." Lena swallowed hard. "She gone long?" she asked. "2 winters." "I'm sorry." He nodded once. "I had someone too," she said after a while. "Not the baby's father. Just someone. He died. And I lost whatever was left of good after that." Colt didn't respond. Just picked up his knife and resumed whittling. She took the spoon and began carving a flower at the handle's end. The porch creaked beneath them, wood warm from the day. From inside, the drawer was empty now, but still smelled like milk and pine and something new trying to bloom. The next day they went to town. They needed cloth, salt, milk. Lena wore one of Colt's coats over her dress. Her hair was braided back, hand steady now. She carried one twin in a sling across her chest. Colt carried the other. When they entered the general store, the air grew quiet. People stared. A woman behind the counter whispered something to her husband. A boy stared too long at the child's face. Someone said charity case under their breath. Lena's spine tightened. But Colt stepped in front of her, gently but firmly, and placed coins on the counter. No words. Just enough. On the way out, a man muttered, "Guess the widower found himself a hoard to keep warm." Lena flinched. Colt turned. Not fast. Not angry. Just turned. And the silence that followed was worse than shouting. Because everyone knew men like him didn't say much. And when they did, the words stayed said. But he didn't speak. He just looked at the man, long enough for the insult to shrivel and for shame to rise like heat. Then he turned back to Lena and said, "We got what we came for." She nodded, though her hands were shaking. On the wagon ride home, she asked, "Why didn't you say anything?" Colt looked ahead. "Words ain't what keeps people safe. Actions do." She didn't answer. But that night, when she tucked the babies into the new cradle, she slipped the spoon in between the blankets. And in the morning, when Colt saw it there, her carving now complete with a wildflower etched deep into the wood, he smiled. And she didn't look away this time. Later that evening, as the wind picked up and the sun dipped below the line of cottonwoods, Lena stood at the window. Colt was outside brushing the horse. One of the babies slept soundly in her arms. The other stirred in the cradle. Then from the drawer, long forgotten, came a soft creak. She walked to it. Inside was a single ribbon. Faded pink. Tied with a shaky knot. She didn't put it there. It was hers from before. From when she'd wrapped it around her wrist as a girl and said, "This is how I'll remember where I came from." She thought it had been lost. She held it to her chest. Eyes wet. Turned to Colt, who was now stepping inside, wiping his hands on his shirt. "You found it?" she asked. He didn't answer. Just nodded once. And she smiled, a little whiter now. The snow hadn't started falling yet, but the air tasted of it. It hung low on the breath, that strange stillness before a storm, when animals move slower and people glance skyward like the sky might answer something it never promised to. Colt stood at the edge of the barn, hands on the rail, watching the horizon. The earth had turned bone dry again, and the sun wore a paler coat than usual. Frost would come first, then flakes. Behind him, the cabin breathed differently now. There was sound, soft living sound. The kind made by babies gurgling and hands folding linens, a broom sweeping rhythmically, the thump of gentle feet moving with purpose. It no longer sounded like a tomb with walls. Lena was humming again. Not loud. Not always in tune. But when she thought no one was listening, her voice slipped out, like a creek remembering how to run. Colt didn't say much about it. Just stayed close. They didn't speak of love. Didn't name what grew between them like moss between stones. But some mornings, she'd hand him his coffee without needing to ask if he wanted it. And some nights, he'd sit beside the cradle and run a finger down the girl's cheeks, slow and sure, as if carving their faces into his memory. They never called it family. But they shared spoons. And silence. And warmth. That was enough, for a while. It was the trip to town that shook it loose. They needed supplies. Cloth. Salt. Medicine for teething gums. Lena had been trying to stretch what they had, but the girls cried more each night, chewing on their fists like the world owed them something. I'll go, Colt had said. But Lena shook her head. They'll talk anyway. She dressed the babies herself. Wrapped them in blankets she'd mended with lavender thread. Tied her hair back in a simple ribbon, the same one he'd returned to her, found in the drawer where her past still lived. Colt hitched the wagon. His coat was heavy on her shoulders, but she didn't ask for her own. She didn't ask for much. The ride into town was slow, wheels groaning beneath them. The babies slept in a crate lined with old flour sacks, swaying slightly as they moved. When they reached the outskirts, Lena tensed. Every house had eyes, even when shutters were drawn. They passed the church first. Its bell was silent, but the steeple cast a long finger-like shadow across the road. A group of women stood outside, all in Sunday grays, though it was Thursday. They weren't praying. One of them nudged the other. That the girl from Parker's, someone whispered, thought she ran off. Or died. She did neither, another said, eyes narrowing. Inside the general store, the air was thick with wood smoke and dried beans. The merchant, Mr. Forley, looked up and smiled too quickly. Colt, he said. Didn't think we'd see you before first snow. Need linens. Teething syrup, Colt replied. Then nodded toward Lena. This is. But he didn't finish. Didn't give her name. Didn't explain. And maybe that was worse. Because now everyone would write her story themselves. They walked the aisles slowly. Lena didn't lift her eyes. Just kept one hand on the crate where the babies slept. One of them stirred, then cried. Too loud. Mrs. Forley stepped from behind the counter, fake smiling. My, they're sweet. Yours. Lena didn't answer. Colt did. They're ours. It was a simple word. But it landed like a drop dish. By the time they stepped out, the air had shifted. A boy on the porch snickered. He's got a whore and a pair of bastards now. Thought widowers had better sense. Colt turned slowly. Not angry. Just sure. Say that again, he said. The boy looked at his boots. Colt didn't step forward. Didn't need to. The silence pressed harder than any threat. Lena climbed into the wagon, face red, jaw tight. Colt climbed up beside her and took the reins. No words. On the ride back she didn't cry. But she didn't sing either. At home, she put the babies down gently, like she was afraid she might drop something invisible. Colt stood in the doorway. They'll talk, she said. They already did. I'm not your wife. No. I'm not your anything. Colt didn't answer right away. Then quiet, you're what's here. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. The babies stirred in the cradle and she sat by them, hands limp in her lap. Her eyes burned from holding back what needed letting go. She tried hard to stay invisible. But that town, those eyes, they didn't forget. She stood, walked to the fire, and stared at the coals until her feet went numb. In the morning she didn't eat. Didn't hold the babies. Didn't speak. Colt placed a plate on the table. Left it untouched. He fixed the shutter outside. Mended the chicken wire. Chopped wood until his shoulders burned. Still the house stayed too quiet. Later the preacher came. Knocked once. Stepped inside like he still had the right. Colt looked up from sharpening a blade. Don't recall a skin for sermon. The preacher's beard was longer than Colt remembered. His eyes small and judgment-tight. Your wife's been missed at service, he said. Colt looked past him toward the window. She ain't my wife. The preacher raised his brows. All the more reason this arrangement concerns us. There are children in your care. And sin breeds confusion. Lena stood just outside the door, holding the babies, listening. Those girls deserve a home with light, the preacher added. Not a scandal. Colt stood, slow, unthreatening, but taller now. I buried my wife in that dirt hill out back, he said. I built a roof with my hands. Ain't no sermon ever fixed hunger or fever or loneliness. That woman in there, she's fed them girls, rocked them, stayed when she could have run. God has rules. And I got eyes, Colt interrupted. I see what love looks like. The preacher left with tight lips. Lena didn't speak about it. But that night, when she placed the babies down, she kissed both their cheeks and then her own hand, like sealing something with her own touch. In the following days, a new rhythm returned. Not perfect, but something close. Then one evening, Colt found something in the firewood pile. A locket. Tarnished. Thin chain broken. He picked it up, turned it over. Inside, faded drawings. Not photographs. Pencil sketched. A child's attempt at memory. A boy. And a girl. He brought it in, placed it on the table. Lena froze when she saw it. He waited. Then she said, "My brother drew that. Years ago. When we were kids and our ma couldn't afford tintypes." Colt nodded once. "He's the one who—" She stopped. Bit her lip. He didn't press. She didn't need to finish. "The man burying the babies," he said. "That was him." She looked away. Eyes brimming. "He didn't start out cruel," she whispered. "Just broke. Then desperate. Then cruel." Colt looked at the drawer where the babies had once slept. "They're not his anymore," he said. That night she tied the ribbon back into her hair. Cooked supper. And they ate side by side, neither saying much. But her hand brushed his when she passed the spoon. The babies gurgled. And for a moment the house felt full again. Until a knock. Not gentle. Sure. Demanding. Colt stood. Lena stiffened. Another knock. The kind made by men who don't care if the door splinters. Colt opened it. On the porch stood a man with a sheriff's star, flanked by two others. "We've got questions," the sheriff said. "About a woman who went missing. And a man who ain't been seen since he was digging in the valley." Colt didn't move. "You see a woman here?" "I see a cradle. I see 2 mouths to feed. And I see a man protecting something that might not be his." Lena stepped into view. The sheriff raised a brow. "Well now," he said. "Ain't you the ghost that town's been talking about?" Lena's throat tightened. The babies began to cry. The sheriff took a step forward. "Ma'am," he said, "we'll need you to come with us." Colt didn't reach for a weapon. Didn't raise his voice. Just said, "You'll need a reason." The sheriff smiled. "Don't worry. We'll find one." The sheriff didn't come back the next day. But the silence left behind was worse than a bullet. Colt didn't speak of it, and neither did Lena. They moved around each other in the cabin like people trying not to wake a sleeping snake. The babies felt it too. They cried more. Clung tighter. Refused to settle unless held. Lena barely let them go. She bathed them in lukewarm water and pressed her cheek to their soft heads, whispering stories from no place in particular. She braided her hair tighter each morning and unbraided it slower each night. Her voice grew thin. Her movements careful. As if the floor might collapse beneath her at any moment and she didn't want to take anyone with her. Colt kept to the barn. He mended a broken stall door and retied rope he'd already tied twice. He sanded the edge of an old trough and rest-tacked firewood no one had asked for. At night he came back in, boots caked with dust, eyes holding the same. They ate in silence. One night Lena finally said, "He'll come back." Colt nodded. "They'll say I'm dangerous. That I'm unfit. They'll say things loud enough the girls will hear one day." "They'll forget it," Colt said. "Or learn what's true." She shook her head. "Children don't forget the way you hope they do." The fire popped. One of the babies whimpered in her sleep. Lena turned her head toward the cradle like it was an instinct she didn't choose. Her lips trembled. She wrapped her arms around herself. "Maybe I should go," she said, not meeting his eyes. Colt didn't move. "You don't owe me anything," she added. "They'll keep circling till they find something. And if I'm gone, maybe they'll leave you alone." Colt stared at the fire. The scar on his forearm caught the light. "I didn't bring you here," he said. "You walked. I was carried." He looked at her then. Really looked. And said nothing. That night she packed quietly. Just a few things. A cloth-wrapped bundle of diapers, a jar of milk, the wildflower spoon, and the ribbon she'd once tied in her hair. She didn't take the carving knife. She didn't take the coat. She waited until the fire had died low and the wind sang outside like a woman grieving something she couldn't name. Then she lifted both babies, one in each arm, and stepped out into the cold. She didn't look back. The door creaked behind her and closed. The silence inside the cabin was immediate. Colt sat still in his chair, eyes on the empty cradle. The drawer still open beneath it. The spoon still resting where she'd left it. He didn't move to follow. He didn't say her name. But he stayed awake. Long after dawn, the barn filled with gray light. He went there not for work, there was none left to do, but because it was the only place that still felt his. He sat on a sack of oats, elbows on his knees, staring at the empty stall where his wife's mare used to sleep. The saddle was still hanging from the peg, leather cracked. Dust rose with every breath. It was quiet in the barn. Too quiet. He stood, walked to the saddle, ran his hand along the horn, remembering hands smaller than his lifting it into place with stubborn pride. Remembering laughter. Remembering the way she used to say, "If the world won't bend, ride over it." Colt exhaled through his nose. The sound of a man letting go of something too old to carry and too soft to drop. He turned and saw something strange. A bundle on the straw. Small. Wrapped in wool. He stepped forward. It was a mitten. Knitted. Lopsided. Yarn faded pink. A child's. And inside it, tucked like a secret, was the ribbon. The one Lena had left behind. He bent slowly, lifting it with both hands. There was no note. Just the mitten. He stared at it a long time. Then he sat back down, and held it in his lap like it might speak if he listened long enough. An hour passed. Then two. Outside, the frost crept over the window panes like silver vines. Inside the cabin, the cradle sat empty. The spoon lay still. Colt returned just past midday. His boots echoed too loud on the floorboards. He boiled water. Didn't drink it. He walked into the back room and touched the folded blanket on her cot. Still held the shape of her shoulders. And when he sat down beside the fire again, the mitten still in his hand, he said aloud, quietly like someone asking permission, "I hope you ain't too far." The wind howled once against the cabin walls. Then stilled. And in that silence, something shifted. The tiniest sound. A soft rap. Not the front door. The barn. Colt stood slowly. He crossed the yard, snow now whispering beneath his steps. When he opened the barn door, the wind caught it, blew it back gently. There near the haystack stood a little girl. She wasn't even old enough to speak full words. But she was holding the ribbon. Tears tracked down her cheeks. And beside her, in the shadows, Lena stood barefoot, holding the other child. Her eyes were rimmed with red. Her lips trembled. "I couldn't go," she said. "I tried. I walked. But they cried." Colt didn't speak. She stepped forward. "I don't know if I belong anywhere. But they looked for you in the dark. They reached for your shirt. I couldn't lie to them." Still Colt said nothing. He walked forward, lifted the baby from her arms and held her close. Lena stared at him, waiting. The silence stretched. And then he looked at her, not like a man rescuing something broken, but like a man remembering something sacred. "You don't have to belong anywhere," he said. "You just have to stay." The next morning came soft. No knocking. No lawman. No gossip riding the wind. Just sun warming frost-laced glass, and two babies cooing like nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. Colt stirred first. He didn't need to check the cradle. He could hear them, smell the milk on the air. But still, he rose and knelt beside it, watching their little fists open and close like sea anemones searching for light. Lena was curled on the cot again. Not like before, huddled in shame, but stretched long beneath the quilt, one leg peeking out, ribbon still wrapped loose around her wrist. She hadn't asked to stay. Hadn't said the words. But sometimes staying is the word. Colt didn't wake her. He brewed coffee just the way she drank it now, too weak to be proud of, too warm to change. He left the cup near her hand and returned to the porch, where the snow had melted in patches and mud made the earth smell like birth again. Later she joined him. The babies were bundled against her chest, one in each arm, as if she didn't trust the world to hold them yet. Her hair was down, unbraided, curling at the ends like it remembered wind and rivers and better places. She didn't speak right away, just watched the trees with him, the kind of silence that had nothing to do with distance. "I heard the sheriff rode east," she said finally. He nodded. Passed through town last night. Preacher said he wouldn't be back. You believe him? No. She didn't ask more. Just shifted the girls in her arms and said, if they come again, I won't run this time. Colt looked at her. Her eyes were steady. Her hands didn't shake. And behind her, the cabin looked less like a place someone survived in, and more like a place someone returned to. They spent the day fixing what hadn't needed fixing. Colt renailed the porch slats. Lena sorted herbs and dried apples into jars. The girls laughed, actual laughter this time, from inside their bellies, giddy and aimless, like birds startled into song. Around noon, Colt went into the barn and came back with something wrapped in oilcloth. Lena raised a brow but said nothing. He set it on the table and unwrapped it slow. It was the cradle carved anew. Not the drawer. Not the makeshift one by the stove. But a real cradle. Etched with soft lines. 2 names carved into the arch, Hazel and Wren. Lena covered her mouth with her hand. I didn't know if you'd name them, Colt said. She nodded, tears slipping from her lashes. Those were my mother's flowers. She used to say you don't name children for who they are, you name them for what you hope they'll survive. He stepped back, gave her space. She ran her fingers along the letters, then looked up. You carved this with your hands? I got 2 of them. She laughed through her tears, the sound cracking open something in both of them. That night they moved the cradle beside the bed. Not hers. Not his. Just the bed. There was only one room now. Not spoken. Not declared. But lived. He moved the boots from the hearth. She placed her ribbon beside the spoon on the mantel. And when Colt pulled a chair from the table and set it across from her, she shook her head. No more separate chairs, she said. He didn't argue. They shared a bench. That night, after the girls had settled, Lena stepped outside. Snowflakes spun lazy above the trees, catching in her hair. She tilted her head back and closed her eyes. Colt watched her from the doorway. She looked like someone who had finally stopped holding her breath. She turned to him. There's something I've never done, she said. What's that? Asked a man to stay. He stepped down onto the porch, boots crunching softly. You don't need to ask. I want to. She stepped closer. Colt, she said, voice trembling. Would you stay? Even when I'm not good. Even when I say nothing and cry at things that don't make sense. He took her hands. I've been staying, he said. Just needed you to notice. She leaned her head into his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, not to protect but to rest. The moon hung above them, pale and full as if it had paused to watch. Inside, one of the babies stirred and let out a cry. Neither of them moved at first. Then Colt turned, opened the door and said, Come on, Mama. She laughed full this time, and followed him in. The fire crackled. The cradle rocked. The wind outside was kind. And on the mantel, beneath the spoon and the ribbon, Lena placed something new. A key. To a house that finally opened.